afternoon to everyone, and good night on my side. I am speaking from Israel because spontaneously we decided to go visit after a couple of years with COVID where we couldn't visit. And we had already scheduled this. And in the new world that we live in, I said the fact that I'm going to Israel doesn't mean I have to reschedule a program once it's on Zoom. And I don't know, I guess some of the good things that we learned in this in the last few months. So I will share my screen. As Rebecca said at the beginning, we were planning to focus on one thing, and we figured that there's so much going on, and we hear so much about the politics in Israel that we don't want to ignore it. So we'll split our program, as Rebecca explained. But a few words before starting diving into our topic, a bit about myself and my position here in Colorado. My name is Itai, and I've already spoken in different groups and also in Kavod on the road in person at BMH. But for those of you who's the first time we are sharing a program, my name is Itai Divinsky, and I am here with my family, my wife Mor, and our three daughters. And we have been in our shlichut, and Shaliach means emissary, literally. So we have been on our shlichut for 2 years already, which means we have one more to go. So we are starting our third and final year once we come back from our visit to Israel. And we come from an area in Israel called Ramat HaNegev in the south, in the desert area. It's called Shezaf. So Rebecca, you are very close. The community is called Shezaf, and really since 2012, this community has been the center of our life, even 2011, because we had the honor and we were fortunate enough to be a part of a group of young families, 6 families we started, who decided to start a new community in the Negev. And the reason we joined that group and the reason the group did what it did was really a belief that that Zionism is not over, that we still have a lot to accomplish as young Israelis. We have a lot of new frontiers. And we decided to combine an old Zionist dream with a new one. And the old Zionist dream is really settling the Negev and starting a new community in the Negev and bringing more population, Jewish population and development and initiatives to the Negev is something that has been a central pillar of Zionism since its beginning, modern Zionism, of course. And the other half was really looking at Israeli society, and we'll talk a bit about politics today, looking at Israeli society and understanding that we need to find more common ground. We need to go back to our Jewish and Zionist values and find a path forward together. Because unfortunately, what has been happening over the decades is that Israeli society has split more and more into different groups. Maybe some of you have heard the former President Rivlin, the speech that he gave a few years ago that was coined the Ne'um HaShvatim, the tribes speech, where he spoke about Israel splitting up into 4 tribes that will have to learn to live together. And we said, we don't want to split into tribes that learn how to coexist. We want to form a society together, form a culture together, form a new Israeli Judaism together. And the fact that my neighbor is Orthodox and I am not should not prevent that. And that was the idea of the community we started. And as I said, in 2011, we started 6 families. In 2012, we actually moved to the barren hill in the Negev, where you can see in the picture. We started 6 families. Today, there are 28, and a very long waiting list of more and more families who want to join. And although there is no road, no sidewalks, the internet speed is similar to the 19th century, more or less. Even though those are the conditions, there are many, many young Israeli families that want to move there. And the reason is that they want to take part in this in this Israeli dream of creating a better future for our children. And that's really what it's about. And that's also what brought us as a family to schlep across the Atlantic with 10 suitcases and as much luggage as you can imagine, with three young children, three young daughters, and move here because we really believe that it is also a big part of our mission of the next generation of Jews in Israel and abroad to strengthen and maintain the connections between the Jews living all around the world and in Israel. And that is really what brought us to JEWISHcolorado. And the fact that JEWISHcolorado with the Shaliach program, with the Shinshinim program, works to strengthen the ties between the Jewish community here in Colorado and Israel was really what spoke to us, what we related to, and what I do during my time here as Shaliach. Part of that idea of connecting to Israel is really connecting to the partnership region in Ramat Negev, which is where we come from, and that is a lot of the context why I am here. So I always try to start with explaining a bit about what it is I do here exactly as Shaliach. So I hope that was helpful. And I didn't even talk about the whole side of the Jewish Agency for Israel, which is I am part of a very large program of shlichim just like me that are situated in Jewish communities all around the world, hundreds of shlichim, emissaries just like me, some of them younger, some of them older, but doing the same work, connecting our Jewish world to one another and to Israel and Israelis. And after a few words about me and what I do here and what we do as a family, I guess we can get started with the first half of our program, and that is a comparison between the declarations of independence. Now, before I dive in, a bit of background of why I felt it was meaningful to talk about this. What we do as people, I think in general, is judge others. Everyone, you sit in front of the TV, you watch the news, and you form opinions or judgments on everything that we see. That is what we do, and I think that is our nature. When we, as Americans, as Jewish Americans, look at Israel, the same happens. We form an opinion about what's going on, about what is being said and done, and we form an opinion and also a judgment. When we, as Israelis, and I am allowing myself to play both sides here after 2 years sharing my life with the Jewish community. When Israelis watch the news or read on social media what Jewish Americans are saying, they do the same. They form an opinion and they judge. And I have learned throughout my 2 years here that one of the biggest problems when Jewish Americans and Jewish Israelis are looking across the ocean to what the and that lens is not the same lens as the other side is looking at. When Israelis look or read or listen to what Jewish Americans are saying, they listen or read according to their worldview, through their eyes and lived experiences as Israelis. When Jewish Americans are looking at the news coming out of Israel, they are looking at that news as through their eyes and lived experiences as Jewish Americans. And those experiences are very different. And when we do not acknowledge that there are differences between the countries, between the people, between the way we look at things, I believe that we reach a lot of conclusions that are not necessarily constructive. And that is why I decided that it is worthwhile talking about this, looking at the declarations of independence, and through them, just like Rebecca said in the opening, better understanding Israel. And hopefully when I go back, I'll do the same in Hebrew for Israelis to better understand the American perspective. And I wanted to start with the words, the first or the opening words of both declarations. So I don't know if anyone here remembers, but the American Declaration of Independence opens with the words, when in the course of human events. The Israeli, on the other side, opens with the words, Eretz Israel, the land of Israel, was the birthplace of the Jewish people. I think everything I'm going to say in this comparison between the two declarations can be summed up into these half sentences. The fact that the American Declaration opens with the words, when in the course of human events, shows something very deep about the American idea, the American experiment. The American idea is a universalistic idea. It's an idea that is meant to improve humankind, that is meant to show how an exemplary society can be built. I'm not going into what society exists today and American politics. Thankfully, I am exempt from all of that because I am Israeli. But the idea behind the establishment of the United States as a country is really to an experiment to try to create something different, something that will alter, that will change the course of human events. That is a very big, very ambitious sentence to start with, when in the course of human events. On the other hand, the Israeli project or the Israeli idea, formative idea, is really about the Jewish people. If the American is very universalistic, the Israeli idea is very, very particular. The Israeli idea is about a specific country, a specific land, the land of Israel, and the specific people, the Jewish people. This is what the people who envisioned Israel, they were not envisioning changing the world. They did not envision bringing a new ideal to the world, to humankind. What they envisioned, was affecting the history of the Jewish people. And as I said, we will now talk about a few more. We'll continue this comparison, but really I think the opening words of both declarations send the message that I am trying to, the comparison that I'm trying to make in a very, very clear way. So universalistic versus particular, or universal versus particular. The historical imperative. So I have here a few quotes from the declaration. In the American Declaration of Independence, when the envisioners try to in the declaration draw a picture of the historical imperative of why this new country is being established, they talk about a long train of abuses. They talk about the right to throw off a government and to provide new guards for the security of the people. They talk about the right and duty, not only right, but duty, to alter their former system of government. So really, the historical imperative of the United States, in the eyes of the people who wrote the Declaration of Independence, was all about creating a better system, getting rid or throwing off a tyrannical government and putting in place a tyrannical government that had abused them for many, many years, and putting in place a new system of government. And it's very much about who governs and how they govern the people. On the other hand, when you look at the historical imperatives of the Israeli Declaration of Independence, it talks about, as we saw, the birthplace of the Jewish people. a connection between a people and the land, nothing to do with the system of governance. It talks about the historical connection between Jews who, throughout the centuries, strove to go back to the land of their fathers. Again, it's a connection or a generations long connection between a people and a land. The right of the Jewish people to national revival in their own country. Again, the right of a specific people, the Jewish people, to of a revival to go back in their own country. And the problem of Jewish homelessness. The establishment of the state will be a solution to the problem of Jewish homelessness. So the people who who envisioned United States as a new country, they were thinking of overthrowing a tyrannical government and creating one that will not be tyrannical. When the people who envisioned Israel as a country, they were thinking of the connection between the people and the land. And they were not thinking at all, or it wasn't a central value, the kind of government that would be established. But the central value was the fact that it was going to solve the problem of Jewish homelessness and give the Jews the right of self-determination in their own country, just like all the other peoples around the world were receiving around those years in many, many different examples. So again, the historical imperative, the context in which these two countries are created is very, 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 very different. And going back to my opening about why we're talking about this, when we look at Israel in American eyes, then we reach very different conclusions than when an Israeli looks at Israel through Israeli eyes, in this context that you see here before you. And obviously the same is true the other way around. A few quotes that have to do with the values that are central to each of the declarations. The American Declaration says all men are created equal. It says that all men are created equal and they are endowed by their creator with certain unalienable rights. The government derives its just powers from the consent of the governed. Again, these values have a lot to do with the legitimacy of the government, what kind of system of government it is, where does it draw its legitimacy from. But I think one of the central values that when people like me who are not Americans, when we look from outside into America, one of the central values that we see that are written in the Declaration and are also played out in daily life in America is the idea that people are created equal and that they have unalienable rights and that the government can take them away. And that is something that maybe it has changed a lot over the years, but definitely there are still many areas of daily life that as a non-American, I can see this playing out in the 2 years I've been living here. And I'll give an example. I've been here for a week and a half. Everyone I talk to asks me how is it living in Denver? Is it nice? And then they ask about COVID. In Israel, the police was enforcing lockdowns with fines. People were being even arrested if they were not sticking to the COVID regulations. In the US, that did not happen. Far from it. And I think, at least as someone who's not American, when I looked at that, I saw in that the idea that the government cannot take people, does not have the authority to take people their rights that were endowed by their creator. That's how this was interpreted by someone like me who is not American. And again, I don't go I'm not going into the political situation in the US, but in a very theoretical level, that's how it can be seen. The values that are central in the Israeli declaration are very different. It, One is that the state will be open to immigration of Jews. So it talks about a Jewish value, the value of ingathering of the exiles, of having the Jews return to the land of Israel. It talks about development of the country for the benefit of all its inhabitants. So when the declaration does zoom out and talk in more universal terms and not only about the Jewish people, it's still the declaration is still specific in the sense that it talks about the inhabitants of the land. So this declaration never talks about all men, never talks about human events. It talks about either the Jewish people or the people that inhabit the land of Israel. So it's even when it zooms out and doesn't talk only about the Jewish people, it still talks about the inhabitants of the land. When it talks about values, it talks about the values in the context of the values that were taught by the Hebrew prophets, which means when equality uh, is is put as a central value in the Israeli Declaration of Independence, the words that follow that are as envisioned by the Hebrew prophets or as taught by the Hebrew prophets. So even that is in the context of Jewish values. And when it talks about offering peace, being a peaceful nation, it offers peace and cooperation with the independent Jewish nation. Again, even when it talks about being peaceful and living in peace with neighboring countries, it's still in the context of an independent Jewish nation, which means it's still a particular context, a particular country for a particular people and inhabitants making peace with another particular country. So even when we look at the values, I think that we see the idea going back to the first slide of particular versus universal. And before I see if we have any questions, just to sum all of this up and connect it to what I started with, I hope that what I was able to show here in these last few minutes is that if you judge Israel by American eyes, then Israel is a horrible democracy. Because what do you mean the right of return is only for Jews? That sounds anti-democratic to an American. But to an Israeli, that is a given. Of course, the right of return is only to Jews. This is a Jewish country. The whole idea of Israel was to allow the Jews to return to the land of Israel and to solve the problem of Jewish homelessness. When you talk about when an American looks at immigration policy in Israel, as I just said, it's the same. Now let's look at Israel. When an Israeli looks at the debate around immigration in the US, to the Israeli, it seems it's something that is difficult to even grasp. What do you mean receive people? What do you mean give me your masses? That is something that for an Israeli is counterintuitive, because Israelis do not understand that the idea of America is to be universal. The idea of America is to impact, to influence the course of human events and not of a specific, and not just of a specific people. And when you look at immigration, again, I'm staying on this topic, when you look at the way Israelis look at immigration and American Jews, now more specifically, not just Americans, but American Jews, then they look at things very, very differently. And the reason for that, the fundamental reason for why we look at things so differently on the issue of immigration is really this, that for Israelis, a country is a political, territorial entity for a people. Whereas in the United States, that is not the way Americans look at a country. And this example I gave with immigration, with the way we look at immigration, can also play out in many different ways. The way Israelis look at the relations between the minority and the majority. That is also something that is very different, and so forth. Many, many, many other examples. So I want to stop here and see if there are any questions or comments before we continue. And that will also give me an opportunity to get a sip of water and some air.
Well, you mentioned the difference between how Israelis view majority and minority. So you do have Arabs living in Israel that I thought had equal rights to at least to a certain extent, except they're not drafted. But what is that relationship between the majority and the minority?
Yeah, that's a great question. So, for example, equal rights is certainly something that Israelis agree on, that the Arab minority should have equal rights. And that wasn't always the case at the beginning. And I'm sure today it's still also not fully the case, but every year that passes, it improves more and more. But for example, if you look at language, or not language, let's look at symbols. For an Israeli, the fact that for an Arab Israeli, a Muslim or Christian Arab Israeli, it's very difficult to connect to a symbol like the Star of David on the flag, like Hatikva, the anthem, which is very, very Jewish, like the symbol of the country, the emblem, which is the menorah, also very Jewish. So all of Israel's symbols as a country are very, very are specific, are Jewish. So the 20% of Israelis who are not Jewish, for them, this is a problem or a challenge. And I think we can use many different words, but at the end of the day, for them, it is a very difficult situation they are in with the symbols of the country that they are citizens of, and they have full rights, but they can't identify with the symbols. I think when an American thinks of the symbols, I think for an American to feel that, or not for an American, for the American idea, everyone in America, any American should be able to identify with the symbols. In Israel, it is a given. That is not the case as a given. We simply cannot, it cannot be the case that if Israel is to be a Jewish state with Jewish symbols. And that is one example. So I don't think it's not in the black and white, the difference. It's not in their full rights or not. It's more in the softer places, like, for example, symbols. You have, let's say, a Supreme Court justice in Israel who is Arab. We've had more than one. Or the captain of the Israeli football team, soccer team. Do they have to sing the anthem? As long as a Jewish soul yearns in me, do they have to say those words? Are they because they reached the public position they have? So there are some. This is a debate in Israel when an Arab Supreme Court justice stands for the anthem but does not sing it. His mouth is closed, and of course this is on TV. That sparks a debate in Israel. Some say, well, we chose a Jewish anthem. Of course, he's not going to sing it. Some say, no, he's part of Israel. He has to sing it. So those are the kinds of areas where I think the American idea and the Israeli idea are so different that the way we look at that relation is different. And I just spoke about symbols. I think for language can also be the same. The way we treat different languages that are used by the population in both countries.
Well, why don't they don't draft non-Hebrews, right? They can't serve in the army, or can they?
No, they can, but they're not obligated to. Jews are obligated to serve. The Druze minority, which is a small group of Arab ethnicity, but they're not Muslim. Not all of them self-identify as Arabs. Some of them also self-identify differently, but the Druze, D-R-U-Z-E, the Druze in the 50s, they decided that they wanted as a community. They petitioned the government to implement the draft law on them also. So they are also mandated to serve. There are many, not a majority, far from a majority, but there are many Israeli Christians and Muslims who also serve in the IDF, but they choose to serve. They volunteer. They don't have to.
Hmm. Well, that's a big difference right there towards minorities.
Yeah, I think that is more actually not on the side of rights, but more on the side of obligations.
Well, I don't know, because I'm looking at this as an American, but I mean, they can choose to join, they don't have to join, whereas Jewish people are required to join. So they have more of an identification, more of a commitment to the nation. It's almost like the minorities. Well, you're here, if you want to join, okay, like are they really part of Israel? I mean, they don't have the same obligations.
Yeah, that is a big question, but I think it's also something that from the beginning it was very clear that the Arab Israelis, Israeli citizens who are Arab, they are torn because on one hand they are Israeli citizens, and they are part of the Israeli community, and their self-interest is the betterment of Israel, just like me and everything else. But on the other hand, they are also part of the Palestinian people, and many times until today, the enemies of Israel are representatives of some of the Palestinians. No, I don't think it's all of them, but some. And you can even look wider. There were times where the idea of an Arab nation, so an Arab living in Israel and an Arab living in Lebanon also have a shared circle of identity, and putting the Israeli Arabs in a situation where they have to go to war against people who they are part of the same nation is something that is very difficult to demand of them, I think.
It's almost like though the Israelis don't trust the Arabs. They don't trust the Arab citizens that they would be faithful to Israel.
That is a question. That is something that is a question. But again, there are many examples of Arabs who serve, and they're welcome to serve when they want to. So I'm not sure that is the case. Any other comments or questions about this part of the comparison, the idea of a universal country, a universal vision versus a particular vision?
I have a comment. I don't know anything about any other declaration of independence from other countries, but based on what I'm hearing, I mean, I know you can't really speak to it since, but I've been noticing that maybe Israel's declaration is the only declaration that's more, I guess, directed to Jewish people since it is a Jewish state. So maybe, do you think that maybe that's part of the reason why maybe a lot of Israelis feel, I mean, maybe that's why it's mandatory to serve in the army and other things like that?
So the Israeli is certainly the only one that is particular to the Jewish people. And this is not exactly an answer to your question, but I will use your question to say something else I wanted to, and then I'll go back. But many times, if from America, it seems like Israel, is a different kind of democracy. But actually, if you look around the world, many democracies around the world are nation states and are more similar to Israel than to the American idea. The idea of the nation state, the European nation state, and many of the nation states in Africa and Asia are more similar to the idea of Israel, of a particular people in a particular territory, than the very universal idea of the United States. And if you look at the European flags, most of them have a cross. Most of them have a religious symbol on them. If you look at Great Britain, the head of the church is the queen. So the head of the state and the head of the church is the same person. So the idea of countries that are particular to a specific people is actually more the norm than the American experiment, which is a novel experiment. And to the question of, at the end of the day, Israel is a Jewish democracy, it's a Jewish and democratic. And that means that the 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 way Israelis see that is that everyone has full equal civil rights, but the rights, the group rights, the rights of self-identification as a group belong only to the Jewish people in Israel. That is the distinction. Everyone has the same civil rights and liberties, but the only group that has the right of self-identification as a group is the Jews. And the way that happens is that there is a Jewish majority. The day that there stops being a Jewish majority, obviously, that is no longer the case. So I think we will. I hope you found that comparison helpful. And the next time you look at Israel and Israel's actions, I hope that this comes to mind and maybe helps better understand the differences and why we think and talk so differently sometimes. And I think we'll now move to the second half of our program. I believe the talk I gave, I'm not even sure when it was, but before COVID on Kavod on the Road in BMH was about the differences between the Israeli and the American political system. So I'm not going to go into explaining how the Israeli political system works. I'm going to talk more specifically about the situation that we are in today. These are the results of the fourth election in 2 years, the one that we had this year. And these are the parties that passed the threshold. There's no limit on the number of parties that can run, but there is a threshold. A party that does not reach 4 seats in the parliament out of 120 does not get any seats. So any party that gets less than 4 seats in the division of the votes among the parties will get 0 seats. That's why if you look at this list, you'll see that the smallest party has 4 seats. There's no parties with 1, 2, or 3 seats in the Knesset because there is a threshold in order to not allow very, very small parties. But as you can see, it's still a pretty big number of parties that we have in this Knesset. And I painted the names and number of seats on the table in the right side of the screen in blue, green, and purple in the way we traditionally divided up Israeli politics. Because Israeli politics is not a 2-party system like you have in the United States, there are many parties. We usually talk about blocks, about parties that are like-minded enough to work together to form a governing coalition together. And traditionally, until a couple of years ago, if I looked at these results, this is how I would split it up. I would say all the ones that are painted in blue on the side, Likud, Religious Zionists, United Torah Judaism, Shas, Yamina, New Hope, and Israel Beitenu, all of these, I would call them right-leaning parties, and they would be the ones, the parties that would join a right-leaning coalition led by Likud in order to form a coalition in the Israeli Knesset, a governing coalition. You need over 50% of the votes. There are 120 members of Knesset. Knesset is Israel's parliament, so you need 61. If you sum up all the blue parties, there is much more than 61 here. which means if I looked at these results 2 years ago, I would say, okay, Likud will be the leader, which means Netanyahu will form the coalition, and they will have a very stable coalition because they have much more than 61. If I looked at these results 2 years ago, I would say that the block of parties that I would call left-leaning or center-left are the four parties that are painted in green, and they would not have a majority, which means they would become the opposition. And if I looked at these results 2 years ago, or even 6 months ago, I would say that what we call the Arab parties, in this case, the Joint List and Ram, they are a category on their own because they are not, they were not in the game. They were not really willing to join any coalition, a right-leaning or left-leaning coalition. So they were in a category of their own, the Arab parties. These are the parties, the major parties that represent Israel's 20% Arab minority. Of course, there are many Arabs that vote for other parties, but the vast majority of the Arab voters vote for the parties that are the Arab parties. Their members are Arab, and their agenda and everything about them. They represent the Arab minority. So this is how I would split it up 2 years ago when I look at these results. And I would say, and then this would lead me to the conclusion that Likud won the election and Netanyahu would lead the next governing coalition. But this is not what happened. And what ended up happening was a division like you see here. And what is the difference? I'll go back for a sec just to show you the difference. There are three parties here that are blue here, which means Yemina actual results of this election did not go with the right-leaning coalition, but actually went with the coalition that we have now. And the other difference is if you look at the bottom of the table, Ram, the party of Ram, which is an Arab party that I put 2 years ago, I would put in a different category, they actually ended up joining the governing coalition. So this green, these parties that are painted in green here on this table are the coalition, the governing coalition that we have right now in Israel. And I will talk about who comprises that coalition in a minute. This is a picture of the new government. So these are not all of the members of Knesset. These are the ones who hold ministerial positions, which means in the American terms, secretaries or undersecretaries. Well, at the end, explained, this is what we ended up with. The Likud led by Netanyahu, which is very much leans to the right, with 53 members of Knesset, which means they don't have a majority, they don't have enough. And what we call the Change Coalition ended up with 61. The Yemina party, the reason I put them with these white dots on the pie chart is that they have 7 seats. The results of the elections gave them 7 seats, but one of the members of that party, out of those 7, one of them refused to join the new coalition. So he is not voting with his party, which means instead of having 62, they only have 61. Which means if it's enough for 1 or 2 members of Knesset to not vote or to vote on a bill differently than the rest of the coalition, and the bill doesn't pass, does not get passed into law. So who are the parties that comprise this coalition? We have 2 parties. We have the largest party is Yesh Atid, center party. Another one of the big parties is Kachol Levan, blue and white, which is also a center. So we have 2 political center parties, and then we have 3 parties on the right, which are Yemina, Tikva, Tenu. Their leaders and members very much lean to the right, some of them even deep into the right. But on the other hand, we also have parties that are deep into the left, Meretz and Ha'avodah. Ha'avodah is labor, those left-leaning parties. And for the first time in Israel's history, 3 years, there is an Arab party in the coalition. So although Arabs have been elected to the Knesset since day one, and there have been Arab parties since day one, they never joined a governing coalition. They never took part in the governing coalition. And this is the first time that they're part of the governing coalition, which means when the leader of the coalition wants to pass a law, a bill, even the budget, when they want to pass the budget, these four Arab members of Knesset in effect have a veto power, because without their votes, the budget doesn't pass. Without their votes is, for the first time, gives these Arab parties a lot of power. On the other hand, it also demanded of them a lot of compromise, because they had a political situation. They have to do a lot of compromises. They have to or agree with, but they have to vote with the coalition on what matters to them. That is basically how the coalition parliamentary system works. So has gone away from compromise and more to each political side getting more and more entrenched in its ideology and less willing to compromise. After years of that trend, what this government does is really push our politicians to compromise. You have parties from the right, left, parties from the center, you have an Arab party, and all of these have to agree on many, many different issues and find some kind of common ground, and that will push them to compromise. And that is a very, very that is something that many Israelis are very hopeful about. But obviously, there are no opportunities without challenges, and this new coalition has many challenges. So I'll name a few. Settlements. There is now a new settlement, but in general, the settlements, the Arab and the left-leaning parties in the coalition oppose the expansion of settlements. The right side of the coalition supports the expansion of settlements, and at the end of the day, this government has to enforce the law, which means if settlers are a settlement illegally, they have to enforce the law. The government has to enforce the law, obviously, and that becomes a challenge for them, because they are very much split on the question of expansion of settlements. Another big challenge for this coalition is that the opposition, led by Netanyahu, is a very efficient opposition. They are very, very seasoned politicians led by Netanyahu, and it is very difficult. This government only started functioning a few weeks ago, and they are already having trouble passing laws because the opposition is putting up a very big fight. Votes are being dragged into the night with filibusters almost every session when they're trying to pass bills. So they have a very effective opposition. One of the big challenges that really has the potential of creating a rift inside the governing coalition that is all about compromise is, what do we do with Netanyahu? There are some who wish to legislate Netanyahu out of the possibility of returning. But especially on the right side of the coalition, that is seen as personal legislation, which they are very much opposed to. They say legislation should never be personal against a person. Legislation should always be law. So how to treat Netanyahu in the election, and at the same time, he is standing trial for corruption. What do we do with him is a big question, which has a lot of potential to create rifts inside the coalition. The question of Hamas, which keeps on challenging Israel constantly. This picture here is not a birthday party. These are terrorists flying incendiary devices into Israel in order to start brush fires in Israel using helium balloon wind. Very, very low technology, but very effective in creating fires in Israel. Another challenge is the diversity inside the coalition. I talked about the fact that there are right and left sides. The prime minister right now, Naftali Bennett, the person in this picture on the left with the kippah on his head, he's a very much a right-leaning politician. He leans strongly to the right. Merav Michaeli, the head of labor, leans very much to the left. She is now the minister of transportation. Now, transportation sounds like a very civil issue that is not really about politics and should be okay. But then you reach the question, do we invest in infrastructure in the West Bank? Do we expand a leading to a settlement? Yes or no? Do we invest more in public transportation, in settlement? Those are questions that, although they have to do with transportation, they are very much political. Same goes with health and any other issue will be a big challenge once they reach the point of passing a budget, which will be in a few months. It will be a big question what happens with the budget when it comes to the West Bank communities, what we call settlements. And of course, the challenge of relations, and the number one, of course, is America with the administration, the Iran deal. We're hearing many reports in the media of the United States getting closer to signing a new deal, or the same deal with Iran. We're not sure. And that will also create a big challenge for this new government to operate with a very diverse, in the international front, remain united. And affairs say one thing and the prime minister say another thing. That will certainly be a big challenge for this as a result of the last election.